Hello, and welcome to GTFO Academy. This series where I go over very specialized topics in-game within a bite-sized format ranging from novice to advanced skill levels. So let's go ahead and get started with today's novice topic, which is how Seafoam applies to enemies. So let's go over some of the basic mechanics of Seafoam. In order to actually Seafoam and freeze an enemy, you need to either use the Seafoam launcher, a Seafoam grenade, or a Seafoam trip mine. Once an enemy has been frozen, they will be unable to move, attack, scream, and perform any other action that the enemy may be able to do. For normal enemies, they are frozen for 8 seconds, giants are frozen for 9 seconds, and boss enemies are only frozen for 5 seconds. Also, while an enemy is frozen, you can essentially consider them as both blind and deaf. They will be unable to wake up from any noise that you make, so smacking the ground near them, shooting, breaking a lock, failing a hack lock, etc. They will also be unable to wake up from watching an enemy die or being close enough to an enemy that would cause them to wake up from the enemy's death. Once the Seafoam wears off, the enemy will return to a sleeping state with 3 exceptions. The first exception is if the enemy was already awake prior to you Seafoaming them. The second exception is if they took damage while they were Seafoamed, and the third exception is if an enemy screamed in the same room as that frozen enemy. Another really interesting thing about Seafoam is that once an enemy has been frozen, the game technically counts them as having moved, so you can ping them with the biotracker. But how exactly does Seafoam work? How it works is actually fairly straightforward. The game keeps track of 2 different numbers pertaining to Seafoam. The first one is glue tolerance, which applies to enemies, and glue value, which applies to the actual Seafoam blob. Whenever an enemy comes into contact with the Seafoam blob, they will absorb it, and if the glue value equals or exceeds the glue tolerance, the enemy will become frozen. For example, strikers have a glue tolerance of 4, meaning if they walk over a Seafoam blob that has a glue value of 6, the striker will become frozen. The game also keeps track of the total amount of glue that any given enemy has absorbed, so you don't need to apply all of it at the same time in order to actually freeze an enemy. Although different enemies may have different tolerance values, each blob of Seafoam that directly hits an enemy has a glue value of 3. Meaning that if an enemy has anywhere from 3.1 to 6 tolerance, it'll still take 2 blobs of Seafoam to actually freeze them. Another thing to note about the Seafoam launcher is that if you shoot a blob on any surface that isn't an enemy, it'll split into 3 additional Seafoam pellets. Unlike when you shoot a blob directly at an enemy, any blob that hits the surface and all the pellets that come from it actually have a glue value that is less than 3. The blob that hits the surface has a glue value of 1.2, and the pellets that split off from it have a glue value of 0.685, for a total glue value of 3.255. If one Seafoam blob comes into contact with another Seafoam blob, they will be combined together and their glue values will be added, with a maximum total value being of 75. Shooting one blob onto an already existing blob will not actually cause it to split into multiple pellets, it will just add 3 glue to its glue value. Additionally, whenever an enemy runs over a pre-existing Seafoam blob, they will not take more than the required amount of glue in order to actually become frozen. This means that if you have a Seafoam blob with a glue value of 24 and a striker runs over it, the striker will only take 4 from the actual Seafoam blob, leaving you with a value of 20 after he becomes frozen. It's also important to keep in mind that Seafoam grenades and Seafoam trip mines will not split into multiple pellets once their Seafoam touches the ground, because it only applies to Seafoam that comes out of the launcher. Speaking of Seafoam grenades and Seafoam trip mines, Seafoam grenades have a total number of 23 blobs that will come out of them, for a total of 69 glue value. While Seafoam trip mines don't seem to have an actual consistent number of blobs that will come out of them once they detonate, the actual detonation or the explosion has a glue value of 250, which is well over enough to Seafoam any enemy that is in the game. Finally, we are going to close off with 2 very notable bugs involving Seafoam. The first one is that anytime Seafoam comes into contact with the floor, there is a high likelihood that the Seafoam will just actually fall through the game world and be completely lost. The other major bug is that if you are the client and not the player hosting the server, it actually requires less Seafoam in order to fully freeze enemies. And finally, to close off, here is a list of all of the different glue tolerance values for each of the enemies in the game as of Rundown 5. Anyways, that's pretty much all I've got. If there's a specific topic that you'd like to see, you can go ahead and leave a comment requesting it, and I'll see about getting around to it. Outside of that, I've got nothing else. Hope you enjoyed, and you guys have fun.